Hey, what's up, folks? I'm back to look at my round 2 game from the 2021 Vegas Open. This was a pretty interesting game in this round. I was paired against Yuta Kakutani, whose FIDE rating is about 2024, USCF rating a little bit higher. And yeah, I didn't really know what to expect for this game. I kind of went in without much preparation. I started out with d4. I just kind of played my normal stuff. Black played e6, knight f3. And here Black played bishop e7, which I thought was a little bit surprising, but a normal move. Black is just preparing to play knight f6 next. And I thought a little bit here, I normally would go for knight to c3, but sometimes I'll play e3 in this kind of position instead. And I decided to go for this one, mainly just to keep the structure a little bit more flexible and to kind of get, both players out of charted waters early on, get my opponent kind of thinking on his own. Normally, I would get the move order like this, where Black plays knight f6, and then I've occasionally played e3 in this position, which I think is a pretty interesting choice. Some folks refer to this one as e3 poison, which I think is, a pretty interesting way to play these kinds of positions, where white is essentially going to be putting the bishop on b2 in many cases, and then just trying to figure out some kind of nice structure to play and hopefully outplay the opponent. So here, after bishop e7, knight c3, we transpose to the game. Black castled. I played b3, just kind of a normal developing move. b6. Here I decided to take on d5 once Black, let's say, suggests that he wants to put the bishop on b7. I thought it's a good time to exchange on d5 and let Black kind of define how he wants to recapture. Now he decides to take with the knight, so we trade knights. And here Black has another choice. He can take with the queen, where it gives white this kind of free tempo with bishop to c4, or he can take with the pawn as it happens in the game. And I definitely prefer this one for white, because I feel like white gets kind of a very healthy little plus here, as whenever Black is going c5 in these positions and trying to take on d4, usually white is going to be able to recapture with a piece and leave Black with an isolated queen pawn. So I was already feeling quite comfortable here. I decided to go bishop d3, bishop f6, and now I just castle. And here Black plays bishop g4. And yeah, I was a little bit surprised by this one, because I felt like what Black is doing isn't fully correct. And once I realized what I wanted to do here, I started to feel much more optimistic about my position. My first thought was to go queen to c2 and attack the h7 pawn, but I wasn't sure if I really wanted to go into this after bishop takes f3. If I take on h7 and then take on f3, then Black plays g6, and normally I would just sack the bishop for a bunch of pawns, but here we can't take on g6 in view of rook to g8. So I didn't really like the looks of queen to c2. I think I would just have to recapture here, and I felt like white should be slightly better, but I didn't want to allow this so quickly. And then after some thought, I realized I should probably just play bishop a3, just develop the bishop with tempo, put the rook on c1, and start putting pressure on Black's c-pawn. And that's kind of the problem for Black in this structure, is that the c-pawn often ends up backwards and somewhat awkward to defend. And yeah, here it's kind of exactly what I was trying to play for. So rook e8, rook c1, and now Black ends up playing c6, which I felt like was already a very good sign, but I realized actually things are very difficult, because if Black plays knight to d7, then I'm going to go bishop to b5, and there's like no stopping bishop to c6, and I think white is just winning here. So after c6, I definitely felt very good about my position, but I really wasn't sure what to do here. Once again, I could play queen to c2, but then after bishop takes f3, gf, g6, I wasn't totally sure about this structure and how things would proceed from here, but I felt like maybe white should be a little bit better. In the end, I decided to keep it flexible. I also considered h3, bishop h5, and then continuing from here. But I thought I would start with this move, king to h1, which is kind of a weird move, but the point is that I'm expecting to one day maybe take gf3, and then I'm getting the king off of the g file and just kind of improving my position in advance. And it's not so easy to see what Black should do, because the knight on b8 is just stuck defending the c6 pawn, and then Black has to figure out how to develop here. Now, after some thought, my opponent played bishop h5, which I realized was quite a good move, because he's just finding a way to improve his position. He wants to play bishop g6 and maybe trade off these bishops. I played rook c2, And I was kind of anticipating that bishop g6 would happen, where I was planning to trade and then play something like queen to d3 and rook fc1. And I felt like white should be somewhat better here. I can also continue with a plan like g3, h4, king g2, h5, rook h1, and just slowly start playing on the king side as well. Because as long as black is tied down to the c6 pawn, I felt like black is going to be very passive here. But instead, I think my opponent played this part really well. He goes a5, and now he's just looking for counterplay on the a file. I played bishop f5, kind of preparing to go queen d3 next. Now a4. And here I had a real choice. Actually, my first instinct was to just play queen to d3 here. And then after something like maybe bishop g6 or a takes b3, queen takes b3, I felt like this structure should be quite interesting for white. Once again, I can go maybe rook b1 here and then take back on b3 either with the rook or with the queen. I felt like white should be slightly better here, but after some thought, I decided that I kind of just wanted to close things up with b4, which I felt like was a very controversial move because we're blocking the bishop in, and okay, if we can get b5 in, that would be great, but black, of course, immediately plays b5 himself. And yeah, I definitely kind of, I think, misevaluated this position because I felt like white would have kind of long-term pressure, but as it turns out, I think white is just ends up slightly worse and not too long. That said, I was still optimistic during the game. Queen d3, bishop g6, takes, rook c1, queen d6, rook c5. And my plan was just to improve my position. I mean, I realized that the bishop looks really terrible, but the idea was to go bishop b2, knight e5, and I felt like I might get some real chances with this one, but I'm simply not in time. Black played rook a7. There are many other ways to play this position, but he chooses kind of an interesting setup with the rook on e6, and I'm not quite able to go bishop b2 as I would like to because number one, he has a3, but I was also thinking knight a6 might be a problem here, where if we trade a bunch of times on c6 and get some endgame like this, I really wasn't sure what's happening here. After knight takes b4, he's starting knight d3 and to take on a2, and I felt like I got to be careful before entering some of these endgames where I might end up losing on the queen side because black has these kind of very strong pawns. So yeah, I take it slow. I play g3, queen e7, and now I decide to play bishop to b2 because now I felt like on knight a6 I could take on c6, and with the queens on the board, I felt like this opening of the position should be good for white. Because with the queens on the board, I can create some chances, I can give check, I can play queen takes b5. I felt like white is doing pretty well here. But instead, black just goes a3, bishop a1, rook a4, and now he's tying white down to the b4 pawn. So yeah, already I was actually starting to really dislike my position here, but I felt like it should still be playable. But yeah, somehow I'm just not in time to really put enough pressure on the c6 pawn, and if I go knight e5, I was thinking black can just take this one and take on b4. So after some thought, I played queen to c3, just defending the pawn. Now black plays queen to b7, and I was aware that black could try to trap the rook with like bishop to e7, but at this point I was already kind of mentally willing to give up the exchange. And it seemed like that's what the opponent wanted. So after a little bit of thought, I played king to g2, bishop e7, and h4. And my feeling was, yeah, I just can't avoid black taking this rook because I have to keep b4 defended. And if I get my queen off of the c file, like queen b3, for example, then knight a6 would come, and I thought this would be a pretty serious problem for white in the end. So yeah, h4. And right away I'm offering the exchange, but if black were to take it here, I think at least we get a tempo on g7. Black should play something like f6. And my feeling was white should have at least some compensation with like knight d4, h5, rook h1. At least I felt like I know what my plan is and what my moves are. Objectively, I felt like probably it's not going to be enough, but at least it wouldn't be so easy for black to deal with. As it happens, black started with f6, which I think makes a lot of sense, just covering the diagonal ahead of time. My rook isn't really going anywhere. I decide to go queen d3 to put a little bit of pressure on g6. Black plays bishop takes c5, dc, and now queen f7. And now black is just an exchange up, and I was a little bit worried here. But yeah, I don't know. Somehow I had this feeling like as long as I can just keep the game going and keep causing problems, eventually I would get some chances. Now I think it was actually stronger for black to take on b4 first. And then if I take on g6, play queen f7 like this, because here black has already captured a pawn, has ideas of like rook to c4, and I don't think white gets nearly enough compensation. But I think my opponent was trying to just hold on to everything really solidly, which does sometimes give us some time to, let's say, get some play going. So I play knight d4, rook e7. Here I was already considering actually this tactic with knight takes c6 and queen takes b5, hoping to get some material and get some pawns going. But the problem is rook takes b4, black takes a very important pawn, queen takes c6. And I didn't think this was going to be enough for white. Maybe rook c4 here, maybe queen e6. Just felt like the initiative should run out, and my bishop on a1 is kind of biting on granite in terms of this pawn structure. So I decide just to improve the position, bishop c3. Now I think, kind of threatening to take on c6, so black played rook a6. And here I push h5, and this is where I started to feel like I'm actually getting a little bit of play, because now I'm fighting for the f5 square, I'm fighting to open the h-file, and yeah, it just doesn't seem that easy for black to consolidate the position. He decided to take. I played knight f5, rook e6. Now I was thinking here I could maybe just start with rook h1 and just put some pressure on the h-pawn. I think that's reasonable, but I decided to play knight to d6 and just immediately kind of force the issue. Because I think if black doesn't sacrifice the exchange back here, then queen g6 comes in and rook h1. I think it does get kind of tricky for black. So I was kind of expecting him to take, and indeed he does. C takes d6. And now I'm still a pawn down, but okay, I got the exchange back, so I'm happy about that. And I felt like I still have play in the position with rook h1 coming and maybe queen f5, and I can just try to put a little bit of pressure on this h5 pawn. And yeah, things are just still not so easy for black. He plays queen e6, rook h1. He takes on d6. I was kind of expecting he might go for the endgame with queen e4 check, but then I felt like white is just going to be actually slightly better after the trade rook takes h5. Because if knight d7, I have this move rook h4, and the position is kind of opened up, and black's rook on a6 is still out of the game. And after rook h4 f5, I realized it would be really strong here to break with g4. And black's pawns are just falling under attack, and I think white is doing very, very well here. The rook and bishop are just super active. So that was just an example of how I think the game could turn in white's favor, but objectively, I still thought black is doing at least fine here, although I did think I have compensation for the pawn. But yeah, he takes on d6, take on h5, knight d7, and now, yeah, we're just one pawn down, and I was looking to create some chances on the king side. I definitely thought about it for a while here, because white has this move queen h7 check, but after king f7, I wasn't quite seeing how to follow up. Like rook h6, I think, can be met with knight f8. And yeah, if I'm not really doing anything with the queen here, I thought it would be stronger just to stay flexible and keep the pieces more active. So I decided to play queen f5, and I was kind of expecting knight f8 here, which was played. I think rook a8 might have been a better defense just to keep the back rank under control. And in that case, I probably was going to play something like queen h3 and look for rook h8 check ideas. But after knight f8, my queen is able to get in with queen c8. And I'm hitting the rook. Rook a7 was played. Bishop d4, again, another tempo. And I did a little bit of calculation here just to make sure that I'm not losing the pawn for nothing on b4. But after this move, bishop d4, I'm hitting the rook. I'm also threatening bishop to c5. And it really forces black's hand. So rook c7, queen b8, rook d7, queen a8. I'm just trying to stay very active. And now the threat of bishop c5 is very annoying for black, so he ends up taking on b4. In case of something like rook f7, then I was just going to happily take on a3, get my pawn back, and just keep the game going, where I felt like now white should just be slightly better. Kind of nice bishop, a little bit of pressure, more active pieces, and definitely the trend has been in white's favor this whole time. So I definitely was starting to feel kind of better and better about my chances. So black goes queen takes b4, which allows me to take on c6. And it feels like, okay, things are still hanging in black's position, but queen c4 kind of holds everything together and hits the a2 pawn. Now it's very important for white to stay active here, so I play queen to a6. And yeah, while my opponent was thinking, I was calculating here, because at this point I'm actually in pretty heavy time trouble, like I'm under 10 minutes. I think black still had something like 14 or 15 minutes here. And I was thinking if queen takes a2 that I thought it would be actually very interesting to sack on f6. Because if gf6, queen takes f6, it just looked like a very, very strong attack. Rook h8 is a threat. If black goes rook g7, then I think this move, rook f5, is quite strong, hitting the knight, and then preparing queen d8 check. So for example, knight g6, white has queen d8 and rook h5, which I thought was kind of a nice line. And yeah, to me, the sacrifice looked super, super strong, like black can defend. But what I didn't notice, the engine pointed out to me after the game, is that in this position, black can just go rook f7, and white can resign because f2 is hanging, and black is going to take on f6 for free, basically. So I might have blundered into that. I'm not sure. White can still bail out and play queen takes b5. I think the position is still unclear, but in my mind, I was really thinking about sacrificing on f6. So if this has happened, if this had happened, I'm not sure what the result of the game would have been. But instead, black played b4, which makes a lot of sense, just keeping the b pawn defended, again offering the queen trade. I play queen to b6, and here I was thinking if queen takes a2, bishop takes f6. I was actually not sure what's happening if black just pushes b3 and just starts running with the pawns. And so I wasn't sure if I was actually going to go for the sack here, because I was quite afraid of this one. And I was thinking that maybe it makes sense just to take on b4, because black's a pawn is strong, but it's also hanging, and the queen on a2 has no moves without dropping the pawn. So I felt like, again, this might be a little bit unpleasant for black, and still white should have some reasonable compensation. But at this point, I think my opponent just started feeling the pressure and ends up collapsing in a couple of moves. He plays king f7 here, maybe defending against the sacrifice, I'm not sure. But this allows me to go rook h8, and immediately I started feeling extremely optimistic here, because my rook is suddenly infiltrated, and black has big issues. Like if knight g6, for example, my rook can swing over to a8, and I'm threatening queen b8, for example, and my pieces are just kind of getting in on the back rank. So I didn't think it was necessarily lost, but just felt very dangerous for black. He ends up going knight e6, allowing me to play queen to b8, and now threatening mate in 1. And according to the engine, only defense here was this move king e7. Just kind of a funny move, preparing to run to the queen side. If queen e8 check, then king to d6, and apparently black is surviving, but clearly I think white has a big initiative. As it happened, he played rook e7, covering e8, but this ends up just getting mated with checks, and I was able to finish the game nicely with queen g8, queen h7, queen h5 check, forcing g6, queen comes back to h7, forcing knight g7, and then queen comes back to g8 to deliver the checkmate. I thought this was kind of a nice little cycle with the queen, first coming to h5 and then coming all the way back to g8 to deliver the mate. So yeah, quite a tough game. I felt like I was worse for a good chunk there, maybe even losing at some points. But what can I say? I just felt somewhat optimistic during the game, and that if I just kept the game going and kept my pieces on good squares and I had some targets, that eventually I would be able to create some chances. And yeah, that's kind of what happened. Just goes to show that, I mean, it's very difficult to defend when you're under pressure. And even though I think my opponent played a very good game, a lot of times it happens where you're under pressure and you're looking for just the most solid way to defend everything, but it's just not there, and you end up kind of collapsing and losing everything. So yeah, I'm on 2 out of 2 now. Next round will actually be starting in about an hour, so I should definitely go rest up and start preparing. But yeah, thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.